And Yves Giroux is the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and he joins me right now. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So I sketched out some of the numbers, but you've crunched all of them, and they don't quite add up. Why is that?
Well, it depends how you look at them. So the government made a promise to balance its operating budget, yet to be defined, granted, but it's also laid out a fiscal plan in its platform during the election campaign. But what we see here doesn't feel like it's perfectly aligned. For example, the government is indicated that it will reduce taxes, and it's already made the first steps towards that in the House. It's indicated that it will increase spending, notably on national defense, but also on other social programs, and at the same time, it has a fiscal track for the deficit. But what we see here is spending that continues to increase for operating expenditures in the main estimates that were tabled recently in the House. So all that doesn't seem to be perfectly aligned. So something's got to give up eventually.
And one of the things that Prime Minister Carney had said when he was campaigning was a cap in the public service. But in your estimation, does that get him there at all?
Well, these estimates are up to amounts. So based on what we saw in the estimates, the operating expenditures are slated to go up. And as I said before, the government could exercise restraints operationally by demanding that departments slow down on the rhythm and the pace of expenditure, but the documents that for which the government is seeking parliamentary approval allows departments to spend more than last year. So that wouldn't be exercising restraint on the operating expenses.
So does Prime Minister Carney have to make cuts to the public service to get where he wants to go instead of just a cap on the public service?
Well, it's difficult to say for certainty because there were promises made during the campaign, but the real test comes in the implementation of these measures. So in the campaign, the government promised to increase national defense spending, for example, $30 billion over a number of years, but it could choose to take a slightly different path, which would allow the government to post deficits that are aligned with its election pledges without cutting the public service, but it would require reducing the speed at which it implements its program. So if the government really wants to implement its program as outlined in the campaign, it would need to, and respect its fiscal bottom line that it also indicated in the campaign, it would mean reducing the size of the public service rather than just capping its growth.
And we know that it already has had a bit of a reduction, about 10,000 fewer workers in the last fiscal year. Would it have to be more dramatic than that going forward?
Well, there will be some reductions, presumably with the cancellation of the carbon tax, the fuel charge. So there were employees devoted to administering it. So these presumably will go, but beyond that, there could very well be further reductions in the size of the public service.
By about how much do you think?
It's hard to say. It depends on how the government wants to proceed with the reductions and what kind of deficit target it has in mind once it decides on the pace at which it wants to implement its own commitments during the campaign.
But do you think that it would have to be by the amount that it shrunk in the last year, 10,000 or more?
It could easily be in that order of magnitude, yes.
I wanted to also sort of highlight something in your report that you were expecting higher debt servicing charges over the next few years. What does that do to our cost of government and really the burden that we continue to carry? So
when the government incurs deficits, it gets added to the debt. The debt is borrowing on the markets, most of which is on the market, obviously, and the government has to pay interest on that debt. So every year that you have a deficit, it increases the stock of the debt and the pool of funds on which you have to pay interest. So this is going up as we have deficits. So we have to pay more and more in interest in debt servicing charges, as we call that. So it reduces the ability to do other things, so to devote fewer funds to devote to other government priorities. So a growing debt, and should we see a return to increasing interest rates, that would mean further increases to debt servicing costs, which are already slated to increase from about $50 billion to close to $70 billion by 2030.
So still significant.
Yes. It's almost as much as the government is collecting in GST.
Wow. I wanted to also ask you that since you're looking at these as the main estimates, it's partly because you don't have a spring budget, which will only come in the fall. How much more difficult does that make your job?
Well, it makes having a good portrait, an accurate picture of public finances much more difficult, because the budget gives you a perspective of government spending for the whole year, whereas main estimates is the bulk of the funds the government will need to finance its operations. But we know that there are supplementary estimates throughout the year. So there's subs A and subs B. So mains is the main, obviously, element of government spending, but there could be add-ons. There usually are. So we don't have an accurate picture of what the government will be spending this year, because this is only a partial picture.
And considering the ambition with which Prime Minister Carney says he wants to act and act swiftly, how much better of a portrait would you have if you had a federal budget in your hands to actually analyze and cost?
Well, we'd have a much better view of the government's priorities for the current fiscal year and the pace at which it will implement its program this year and for the following 4 or 5 years. So in the absence of a budget, the only document, fiscal document, is the main estimates, and that gives only, as I said, a partial picture for this year. It doesn't tell us what the government plans on doing next year and the following year, so it's a very partial picture on government finances.
I've only got about a minute left, but I wanted to ask you, the new way that this new government is going to be looking at finances, separating the operational budget from the actual capital spending. We don't expect it to happen to next year, but how does that change how Canadians and how you look at the government's finances as a whole?
Well, it will change how the government, I expect this will change how the government reports on its deficit figure, but it won't change significantly how we look at public finances, because the government will still presumably have to respect accounting standards and internationally recognized accounting standards, not just the Canadian ones. So we will be able to make sense of the real deficit as we currently measure it. And one thing that won't change is whether the government characterizes something as operating spending or investment. It will still need to borrow money to finance these operations. So the financial requirements will be the real picture, well, will paint an accurate picture of the current financial situation, irrespective of how the government wants to present that.
Do you feel like it's a form of creative accounting to try and make things look better for the federal government?
I wouldn't say that at this point, because we haven't seen the details yet, and there are consultations going on right now. So we'll see when we have the details of what the government wants to concretely implement in terms of changes.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Yves Giroux, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.